Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul, forever and anon. I'm very excited to talk to our guest today. Before I introduce him, I want to make sure you know who I am. I am Richard Littauer, and that's Lima Indigo Tango Tango Alpha Uniform Echo Romeo, for those of you who only use the military alphabet. Very excited to be here today. No other co-host today. If you want to be a co-host or you want to yell at my co-host to be more on podcasts, go ahead. You have their emails. That'd be great. But I'm joined today by an illustrious guest, so I don't even need to talk about my co-host. We can just talk about him. Alexander Petros is joining me today from New York City. He is the core maintainer of htmx, not L, X, as well as a freelance software engineer. Alexander, how are you doing today?
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here as well. So Alexander is a core maintainer of htmx as a JavaScript library, and he's an aspiring contributor to the HTML standard. A couple of years ago, he was put in charge of a Java 8 monolith and realized that the ancient ways of building websites had some forgotten merit, which is very exciting. And he's been chasing that dream of a maintenance-free web service ever since. You can read about those efforts on his blog, Unplanned Obsolescence. I got in contact with Alexander because of his awesome video he gave at a conference. The conference was Utah JavaScript, and the talk was building the 100-year web service, which sounds very awesome. So, Alexander, a lot of questions. Just to begin, what is HTMX and how is it different than HTML?
So htmx is a front-end JavaScript library. It's about 4,000 lines of code. You import it directly and with a script tag into the document, and it adds a couple attributes to HTML. So the idea behind HTMX is that a core missing feature of HTML is the ability to do a wider variety of network requests and do more interesting behavior with the results of those network requests. So right now, there's basically two ways to make a request from HTML. You have a link, which does a page navigation, and you have a form, which submits some data and then does a page navigation. And if you want to do literally anything else, then you need to use JavaScript. And the idea behind HTMX is that you don't have to add that much to HTML to add a really powerful set of behaviors that remove a huge chunk of what people are doing in JavaScript with just a handful of HTML attributes. So HTMX adds a couple new methods to HTML. Instead of just post and get, you also get put, patch, and delete. And it also lets you put those requests on any element. So you can do it with buttons. You don't need forms. And it also lets you insert the results of those requests into the document wherever you want. And you can do, I think, 90% of what people do on websites today just by having partial page replacements with those methods.
So I always think of HTML as the scaffolding upon which a website is built, with CSS being the paint and JavaScript being the thing that moves wings around like a Hogwarts castle. You're saying that the scaffolding itself could also do some of the language work.
I think that's how HTML was designed. HTML is hypertext markup language. So the hyper refers to the behavior. Otherwise, it would just be a text markup language, and then you could add behavior later. So the hyper is the idea that we're not only encoding what is on the page, we're also encoding what you can do. And the most powerful form of that is the hyperlink. So it's much richer to read a Wikipedia page than it is to read an encyclopedia. Boy, it's been a while since I thought about paper encyclopedias. But that's a richer experience because not only do you have text, you also have images and you have links to other parts of the encyclopedia. So the idea that HTML is behaviorful is a core concept of HTML. And we reached a point in the evolution of the web where people wanted to do things with HTML that HTML's behavior did not support. So they turned to JavaScript. And at this stage, I think that means that there's a lot of web developers who came up in a culture, myself very much included, where the idea that HTML had any behavior at all, that it was more than just scaffolding, was completely alien. When I first got to the place where I needed to do actual web services, I didn't even know that you should use a form. I didn't know what a form did. I really didn't even know that much about links. So this is a revitalization of that idea that behavior belongs in the HTML.
There's a beautiful website that was built like 10 years ago by a marketer saying, this is a web page, it is responsive, it is perfect, there are no issues with it. It works in every browser, you don't need anything. And it was literally just text on a page. And there was like nothing else. You know what I'm talking about?
I do. It's got a curse word in it that I'm not allowed to say on your podcast. It's just an MFing web page. It has no CSS whatsoever. And there's a number of riffs on that concept. There's a follow-up called Better MFing web page. And that has just like 7 CSS declarations and it looks a million times better. I actually think one of the best innovations that browsers have had in the last 10 years is the introduction of reader mode, which says, hey, you've told me, the browser, how this text is structured. I, the browser, am just going to yeet all your formats into the trash bin, and I'm going to put this in a really nice readable format that's adaptive to whatever browser and format you're using. Are you on the web? Are you on desktop? Are you on a Nintendo 3DS? Which is an extension of larger accessibility principles.
Okay, good. I'm glad we're on the same page, the same mother web page.
Yep.
Very exciting to be there with you. I do have one question. It sounds like you're just trying to recreate jQuery, because jQuery is a really simple, small JavaScript language that does all these things already, doesn't it?
If you had to guess off the top of your head, what percentage of websites roughly use jQuery today?
80?
I think it's like in the 70s, according to the main website you go to figure these things out. So yes, htmx started life as a jQuery extension called intercooler.js. And I should clarify, I'm not the creator of htmx. I'm one of the core maintainers. But nevertheless, I know the history because I'm involved in the project. But Carson Gross, the creator of htmx, he made a library called intercooler.js that was a jQuery extension. And then during the pandemic, he said, let me see if I can rip the jQuery dependency out. And he polished the interface a little bit, and that led to htmx. It's important to understand htmx as the continued development of a paused intellectual idea, which is that HTML is good, HTML does useful things, and if we add a little bit to its abilities, then we can make an entirely new category of websites that currently require JavaScript. So jQuery is the perfect example. And I think that there's a lot of people right now making websites who think they need a lot of build steps, virtual DOMs, and really conceptual overhead to make a website, when really what they need is a slightly better HTML. And that's what jQuery is. And now that's what htmx is.
When you think about htmx and why it's important that you do this work, why you restart this pause thread of what HTML should have been, are you thinking of people like me? Is that like your target audience?
Yes, explicitly. There's a previous Sustain podcast guest, Julia Evans. She has a blog and she talks about how she wrote it in Hugo 0.3 or something. And now Hugo's on 5 point something. And she doesn't need any of the new Hugo stuff. She just needs to get the very, very old version of Hugo running on her laptop so that she can update her website. The blog is about all the hoops she has to go through to do that. But in my head, I'm reading it and going, you shouldn't have to do that. Your website should just be there for you to pick it up. So a big part of my intellectual journey was having exactly that problem, where a couple times I was like, I need a personal website. And I had learned how to make a website in React, or I had learned a little bit about static site generators. And I stumbled multiple times on the hurdle of like, well, how do I get started? What's the right thing I need to install? Am I choosing the right static site generator? Oh, I don't know Ruby. So should I use Gatsby because I know React and I know JavaScript? So there's all these conceptual hurdles. And what finally got me to make my first blog was I just started writing HTML files. I copied manually the styles. This doesn't scale at all, right? But it gets you started until you get to a point where you know what higher level abstractions you actually need. And every website that I've written like that, every time I want to come back and update it, I never have that thing that you just described. I never have that moment where I have to reinstall something that I no longer understand. I no longer understand why I need it, and is not really even supported maybe for my current computer. I just have files and I can update those files and they work. And I think a lot of people undervalue that. And we're going to see the costs of that over time.
So XKCD version 927 is the one that talks about conflicting standards. There are all these standards. Let's just make another one. Oh, no, you have another standard. How are you avoiding that in building HTMX? How are you not just causing another complicated thing that people are going to have to know? Okay, here's HTMX and here's HTML, and here's why they're important.
Well, first of all, HTML is the hypertext. There are no other relevant hypertexts. There's no other relevant way to make websites. Yes, there are other ways to make HTML, but at the end of the day, you're going to have a thing that is, in some sense, HTML. So that's the universal standard, and there really isn't anything competing on the horizon. So you start from that base point. Anything you do on top of that, and I mean literally anything, I mean including CSS, is a thing you are on some sense on the hook for maintaining and updating into the future. So the Cambrian explosion of the web was the introduction of the mobile browser. And I don't know, I saw on Twitter a while back, somebody's like, the Cliff Bar website used to be so creative. And it was like, there were cliffs and there was a sidebar and there were people climbing. And now the Cliff Bar website looks like any other website with a single page layout. And the reason for that is that a bunch of people made a bunch of websites under the assumption that they were going to be consumed on a desktop browser. And then all of a sudden, everyone's websites were consumed on a different type of browser. So they had to update all that. In the talk you referenced, Building the 100-Year Web Service, one thing that I learned in the process of researching that talk is that the original web browser was command line and terminal based, because of course it was. And the interface for clicking on a link in a command line browser is very different because there's no clicking. So they put little numbers next to each of the links and you type in the number in your terminal to navigate to that link, and then it shows you that. So HTML, by describing both the content and the behavior of the page, is the maximally adaptable standard. It can adapt to even non-visual interfaces. A lot of accessibility tools do this, but it can adapt to different formats that we don't anticipate today, reader mode being another example of that. So with that conceptual frame, which is that anything I add to HTML is a thing that I, the developer, am responsible for maintaining, htmx adds very, very little. And it does so in a way that not only do we hope is adaptable in case in the future there is a better htmx. There are browser native tools for doing partial page replacements and the additional HTTP methods. But also, Carson and I are working on taking some of the core concepts of HTMX, the most standards compatible ones, and actually putting them into the standard. So in the next 5 to 10 years, it's possible that there may be people with HTMX sites for whom HTMX is legacy code. It's a thing you don't need anymore. It's a thing that they're on the hook for maintaining. And yeah, there will be a little bit of work required to bring it up to speed with modern HTML, which hopefully includes some of those behaviors, but it's very little work. And so you, as the developer, have to exercise some taste. And as the library author, you have to exercise some taste. So that work in the future can be very little.
Alex, that's awesome. That's really cool. Going to your talk, Building the 100-Year Web Service. Tell me about what you envision for 100 years from now with HTMX.
So the title of the talk is deliberately a little provocative because there are a lot of people who will tell you that that's impossible, that software's changing, everything's changing all the time. And I disagree with that for a number of reasons, not the least of which being that's just a super nihilistic way to think about making anything. Nothing matters. It's all going to change. Why try? I don't plan to live my life that way. No, thank you. Second of all, I don't think it's true. The standards XKCD comic is a pretty great example of why in the web space in particular, I don't think that's true, because there was one standard 30 years ago and it's still the standard today. People do different things to make it, but CSS gets better. There used to be people who did CSS preprocessing libraries, and now those are largely unnecessary. So the web is, I think, going to be the most effective delivery mechanism for software for the next couple decades. And I talk about a couple of the reasons why in the talk. I mean, just look at it. If you made a website 20 years ago, that website not only is still around, probably, but it's displaying on devices that you didn't anticipate. That's a huge win. That's not true. There are iPhone apps that I downloaded when I was a kid that no longer work on modern iOS devices because the developers gave up. They're like, I don't want to keep paying the fees. I don't want to update this to the new SDKs. The web has a different set of values, and those different set of values lead to much more sustainable software. So I think we can look at the software ecosystem right now and say, oh, if I wanted to make a thing and I wanted it to be around for a really long time and I wanted it to be useful to the widest number of people, obviously I would put that on the web. And that is a very powerful paradigm for understanding software and understanding software that one might build for a very long time. So the conceit of the talk is, if we look at the tools that we have available today, which tools can we use that are most likely to get us to that 50, 100-year useful piece of software?
So I have a sort of overarching question. If we think about the web as being one of the best resources for displaying information that we have as a species, which I would argue that it is, it's amazing. What are the next best? The next best are journal articles, which are mostly PDFs. So PDF is a format. DocX and ODT, I would argue, are two major formats. Markdown at this point, because it's how all of GitHub is rendered. Yeah. It's like incredibly important.
And basically just a text file at the end of the day, a Unicode text file.
Yeah. So a Unicode text file. So I'm curious, HTMX, ¿por qué no DocX, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
The Library of Congress has a list of data formats that they like, that they think are worthwhile for archival data. A bunch of interesting ones in there, including, by the way, the SQLite database file format is standardized. And the Library of Congress is like, yeah, you want to give us data in the SQLite file format? That counts. Annoyingly,
I did not know that.
SQLite's very proud of this. It's prominent on their website. Annoyingly, HTML is like a secondary recommendation. They're like, fine, if you want it to be HTML. And I understand, I think, where they're coming from, which is that HTML is a slightly different goal. It's not really a data cataloging or preservation format. It's more of an interactive data format. And a big part of htmx thought, a big part of what brought me to the project is Carson, the creator, has done a lot of writing about hypertext, REST, a lot of kind of highfalutin theoretical talk that I think many web developers dismiss as being overly academic and not relevant to what they do, but has opened my eyes to the strengths of HTML as a concept. And what HTML and REST are good at is giving you data and then giving you kind of embedded within that data, describing to the user, here are ways that you can change that data. So that means that if I have a bank account and I am seeing in divs or paragraphs or whatever what my bank balance is, I'm also seeing buttons that are like, send the money to someone or put the money into a different account. So every time the server responds, it's not only telling you, here's what the state of your application is, here are ways that you can change that state. And if you really boil it down, that's 95% of what people are doing on the web. They are looking at some data in a server that's somewhere, and the server is telling them, if you want to make some changes that can have some impact on your real world life, then here are the actions you can do. And so that's a very powerful, very flexible paradigm for interactive services. And docx, PDF, those things can't do that.
No, that's fair. That's a really good answer. It also comes back to the point I have in my head that like Google Sheets is like the most important tool in the world because it's what most of us are using to actually do our actual life.
Sure. I'm increasingly trying to get my stuff out of Google generally.
Good move.
Google Sheets 10 years ago, revolutionary tool. Google Sheets now, more or less the same tool it was 10 years ago. And also I'm getting notifications about how I'm running out of space. So that doesn't seem super future-proof, but I agree that it showed what was possible.
So this is great. You're trying to figure out how to get HTML to be better. I totally approve of that. But why don't you just use a Docker container like everyone else? Like, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with using NPM and just having like a package manager? Doesn't that solve all these problems anyway?
Docker in particular, I have a bit of a beef with because I totally understand what it's useful for. And I've come across many web services that I was put in charge of maintaining where the first thing I said was, we got to Dockerize this because whatever solution we have to keeping the local Redis and the local Postgres and the local web server and the local static file server together is not working. Docker, let's do it. However, because Docker has now become the boat that we all sail in together, I think it's kind of easy to forget how nice the development experience is when you don't have that thing. And I didn't actually talk about this in the 100-year web service as much as I would like. I didn't talk about Docker at all. But a big part of why the recommendation that I have is that you start with SQLite as a data storage method is because it is dramatically easier to develop with SQLite on a number of levels than it is with any other data format. Just like off the top of my head, there's no additional process running. So if you have a Node.js web server and you have a SQLite file, you don't have to start all the Docker stuff to develop. And these seconds that you get back doing that, they add up real quick. They don't have that moment of like, well, here's 10 seconds for the Docker to warm up. Oop, the daemon's not started. All this stuff that like we are used to because it's necessary to maintain the kinds of services that we've created in the last 10, 15 years. You can actually resolve that by not building that way. So it works for some stuff, but it is better to not have those problems at all.
Which brings me to like my next question, which is industry best practices, et cetera. There's a reason we have React. There's a reason we had Angular. There's a reason we have Vercel. Like if I'm going to build
times
a
I've heard that sentence.
I hear you. But let's imagine for a minute that I am working with tens of thousands of people and they all need to use my website. Yeah. Does HTML really deal with the things at scale? Like, can you make Signal the app in HTML? I would argue no. So isn't what you're talking about, all the tools you're saying you can do it simpler? Isn't that just saying, well, ignoring all the hard, difficult problems that you already have? How are you not preaching to the choir?
This is the Sustain open source podcast, right? How many open source projects have tens of thousands of developers at their command?
There's not a lot.
I'll give you a more comprehensive answer. I'm going to shout out my friend Aram. I'm sorry if I pronounce your last name wrong, Aram, but Aram Zuckerscharf. I worked with him at the Washington Post. He's still there. He's a big open source guy, kind of introduced me to a lot of the web standard stuff. He told me something that I didn't understand for years. And it was before I was involved in htmx, which is that React solves an org chart problem for Facebook specifically. And the org chart problem that Facebook has is there's a website, facebook.com, where there are about 10 different business units that are displayed to the user when you open facebook.com. There is the marketplace, there is the friend graph, there's the newsfeed, there are sponsors, there are posts from your friends. There are a bunch of different things happening. And what Facebook needs to solve is they need a lot of people to be able to work on what is fundamentally one .com/website. So what React does is it lets you repeatable, reusable, and ultimately packageable across different business units in your organization. And I think that doesn't result in a better website, is basically what I'm saying. At some point, there was maybe a point where before web browsers had the capabilities that they have right now, where you could push the limits of what was possible in the DOM to push those limits in a way that was necessary for businesses. But I think that most people don't have that problem. It's like a cliche to say you don't have Google's problems, you don't have Facebook's problems. But React primarily solves the problem of how do I get lots of developers to coordinate on one website? And it turns out that actually breaking your website down differently can lead to a different set of problems that are ultimately more manageable than the problems that React causes.
So I want to get your thoughts on this. Open source solves an org chart problem. I think a lot of open source software is only there because a large industry needs to use work that's been done by other people, and they can't figure out how to get it past their lawyers, or large corporations who want to get past antitrust law. A lot of open source is really just there because they needed a way for anyone to be able to use any code. This is why ethical licenses keep getting shuffled off into the corner, because large industry can't use it because they can't touch it with a 10-foot pole. And so you are mostly involved. I mean, you're partially involved with open source. It's very clear that you do open source stuff, but I feel like a lot of your work is actually about open protocols. It's about building a tool that can be better. Like HTML isn't necessarily open source. It's a protocol. Can you tell me about whether you see one of those being more important than the other, or does that match your understanding of how open source works?
Yes. And my interest in protocols is even more than I've talked about publicly because I'm working on ActivityPub stuff on my free time too. I think that's very interesting. There's two things going on with open source. I actually don't typically think about open source this way, but it's definitely true, which is that why does Facebook open source React? To be honest, I don't fully know, but I think it has something to do with what you're describing, which is it benefits them to have a bunch of people dependent on software that they control and can get out freely and share with people. The ecosystem is valuable and they need it anyway. So they might as well benefit from that in some way. That is very different from where something like htmx comes from, and where there are open source software projects that are passion projects, and maybe they succeed to the extent that they become sustained projects via donations, via sponsors, maybe a business model where they host, what have you. And then there are open source projects that are like, we're a big company, we made a thing, you can have it if you want. And by the way, we have tools that you're going to need if you want this to work for you. Those are both open source, but they're very, very different models, and they produce very, very different software. And I think that one thing that is very uncomfortable for a lot of the open source community to talk about is that different structural project models produce very different software. And I say this with no judgment, but I think there's a little bit of a monoculture around what types of licenses, what types of open source counts as open source and which ones don't. And I think that's a little narrow-minded.
Kind of reminds me of O'Brien's law, which is that your OSPO will mirror the shape of your open source projects, or the other way around, the corollary. That's Dwayne O'Brien, also Miles O'Brien. It's like my favorite reference. Speaking of sustaining open source and of people who are getting sponsorship for their work, how are you personally funded for all this work?
I'm not. Just straight up, I do it because I want to do it.
Passion projects are the best.
There would be more that I could do if there was a way to make money from it. But as a freelance software engineer, kind of the bet I made by going freelance was that I could take the efficiencies that I had discovered via htmx, and I could take a little bit of my work from that project and make websites for people in a way that was cost effective and thereby make money. And that worked sort of for a little while, but I got tired of it and I am in the process of taking a job. So I don't think that the passion project, we're making good software because we want to advance the industry in some way. I don't want to be negative, but I don't really think that super works. Carson, the creator, is a professor and he has a job and he used to work in the industry. I mean, that's part of why talking about open source as one concept is a little misleading, because there are two, if not many more kinds of things that could be happening when you talk about open source.
I've been spending a lot of my time recently on the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, which is about as much fun as hitting yourself in the head with a brick. And I'm really curious about your thoughts about whether all people who work on protocols are people who are either trying to figure out how to put a thing on their website saying, I'm industry standard and therefore you should pay me more money, or they're dumb. I can't figure out what the incentive is to work on these low-level things half the time. It has to be a passion project because it's really hard to work in these protocols unless you're paid to do so by one of the FANG people, right? It's really hard to work on the core tie-ins for the web with all the context that's necessary without losing time or money.
And also going a little insane. Sometimes I tell people that capitalism is very clarifying, and that's a value neutral statement. But within a business, there is a very clear hierarchy. There's a very clear set of incentives, and there are clear decision makers. And outside of the business, as the business interacts with other businesses, there's a clear structure by which decisions get made in those interactions. And what protocols and standards, because they have so many volunteers and they are trying to contribute to something that is maintained by companies. I mean, we don't need to be coy about it. The browsers and the HTML standards are the biggest companies in the world. So you have a system where volunteers say, this is what I think is the right thing to do. And they get frustrated because they either run out of time or they run out of energy, or there just isn't interest, and it feels unfair. And I don't think that is the fault of standards people. It's not the fault of the browsers. It's just a system that is frustrating. And until the US government jumps in and says, we're going to fund a web standard browser, or the European Union says, it's important to us to be able to be stakeholders in the HTML conversation, we're going to devote $500 million a year to making a competitive web browser, then the resources to do that well comes from companies, and companies have their own incentives. And that just is what it is. So it's a very frustrating process if you don't come at it from the right perspective. And it's frustrating even if you do.
Yeah, I wonder if there are other possible players in that game too. I mean, China is obviously a huge one. Asian is another one. ASEAN. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. I have one final question, which is that you talk about the 100-year web service, which is great. And there are other people who thought about these sorts of things before. I'm talking specifically about the Long Now Foundation, which has their 10,000-year clock that they're working on. And they have a nice bar in San Francisco you can go to called The Interval. I'm just curious, have you thought about the 1,000-year approach to the work that you're doing?
100 years is enough, I think. Yeah, I think that's sufficiently ambitious. Earlier on, we talked about how there's this idea that everything is always changing and we live in the most changing time of all times. And there are ways in which that is obviously true. But I don't think that means that we can't plan for anything in the long run. There were movies 100 years ago and there's movies now. And the movies look a little different, but that's a thing we still do. And at a high level, it used to be that if you wanted to talk to a lot of people, you had to write a book or a pamphlet. So in 1500 or so, they found a way to make it really easy to make pamphlets and news. And then we had kind of a new form of mass media. And then it got even easier with the radio and television. And we were able to reach kind of a one-to-many or few-to-many relationship with media that persisted for a little while until the internet came along. And now we have a many-to-many relationship where anybody can talk to anybody basically at scale. And I don't really know from an information standpoint what could come after that. I'm sure something I can't envision. Maybe we're just beaming our thoughts to each other all the time. And that's a degree of simultaneity and openness that's unimaginable to us now. But if we're going to be creating things that anybody might read around the globe, I think that that's a paradigm that's just going to exist for a while. And I don't see anything on the horizon like HTML that can do that many to many, or like websites really, that deliver behavior and data as cost efficiently as HTML does. Totally possible something comes along, but I'm just looking at the horizon and I'm not seeing it. So I think that for at least 100 years, this is a information model that is worth investing in and understanding.
But while you're working on it, don't forget the subtle podcast as the best way to deliver information to everyone's inbox.
I don't disagree. You talked about protocols earlier. I know you're half kidding.
I was joking.
But I want to take that joke, and I super agree with the joke, which is that business models and protocols interact in an interesting way. And it's interesting that we used to use RSS for all sorts of things, right? We used to use RSS to share. You could subscribe to newspapers, you subscribe to blogs, audio, what have you. And now a lot of people think RSS is dead, but it's not dead. It's podcasting. And that's because podcasts were able to find an economy of scale that worked for them, that made money, that used RSS. And the many attempts to enclose the podcasting ecosystem in a proprietary format. You publish a podcast, I don't. I know it's sort of annoying to publish to all the places, but it's still kind of RSS. And you can follow with RSS, and it's open that when you have a direct relationship with your listeners. And that's because podcasting as a concept found a business model where RSS worked. And that's better for everybody involved if you can make that work. It turns out it doesn't work for text. So when we talk about protocols, we have to think about what kind of business model shopping works on HTML. Why would you have a store on HTML versus a store in an app? Well, because no one will take 30% of your profits. So there are businesses that work on protocols. And if you can make those protocols useful enough that they make money, people will stay on them because they like having that direct relationship. So as a frame of mind for thinking about how to make protocols more useful, how to make the internet more open, how to give people more control, think about how to make it worth somebody's time. And right now, HTML in many respects doesn't do that. I like blogging because I love writing, but it doesn't make me any money. If it did, then it would be worth more people's time. More people would do it that way. So,
yeah, I heard that. This doesn't make me a lot of money either. And funders, if you're listening, that would be really great. But we're running up on time. Alexander, this has been absolutely excellent. Thank you so much for talking to us today. Where can people find more of your thoughts? You mentioned you like blogging. I know I mentioned your site earlier, but why don't you plug it again?
So my main software blog is called unplannedobsolescence.com. It's about how to write software that doesn't rot. And you can find all of my socials and all my other writings, talks, whatever at alexanderpetros.com. Don't have anything else to plug at this time, but check out htmx. It's a really good way to make a website.
Awesome. You can find those links in the show notes as well. Podcast.sustainoss.org. You can also find some of the other podcasts we referenced here, like Julia Evans's, which was amazing. That was podcast number 238. But don't leave yet. At the end of every single podcast here on Sustain, we have a section called Spotlight, where we highlight other people, projects, or things that we think are just amazing that really should see the light of day. I am going to spotlight the ICZN today because I'm not sure I've done that before. This is the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, which I referenced previously as a massive headache, which it is. But like a pan-galactic gargle blaster, it is actually still fun to ingest and think about. The ICZN is both the commission and the code, and it's the people who make rules and the rules of the code about what scientific names should be, and for animals in particular. There are other codes for plants and bacteria, but the ICZN in particular is for the 1.9 million life forms that are in the animal kingdom. And it's really, really interesting, and I think broken in a lot of ways. And I would love to talk about that further. Even though it is broken, it is still awesome and used. And every single species name, Homo sapiens included, falls under it. So super cool. It's just a really interesting thing that all scientists use. I just love it. Take a look at ICZN.org. That's my spotlight. Thank you all the people who do good work there. Alex, what's yours?
I am a huge fan of a Node.js library called Better SQLite 3. It's by a fellow named Joshua Wise. And this library, I think, gets the interface for building a database from Node.js perfectly. It's synchronous. It's super fast. It's got a great API. And SQLite is one of the things that unlocked my understanding of what would be a better, simpler, more durable paradigm for making websites that have a database backing. And Better SQLite 3 in particular is an interface for Node that helped me understand, here's the way that this should connect to the server logic. So it's totally free. There's a Patreon for sponsorship, and I would definitely check that out. Really unlocked something for me, and it's a great library. So shout out to Joshua Wise. you're appreciated by me at the very least.
Amazing. You can find and sponsor that project on GitHub at WiseLibs. Links are also in the show notes. Listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this podcast. If you have, there are several things you can do. You can like it on your device where you currently listen to it, wherever you listen to it on that device. You can go to podcast.sustainoss.org, check out the show notes, follow the links, have a good time. You can email me at richard@sustainoss.org if you have any thoughts. You can obviously contact Alexander at Unplanned Obsolescence, which would be really, really dope. And of course, you could sponsor this podcast. We are running out of funds drastically fast. And it would be really nice to have more funds available at some point so we can continue. You can do that on opencollective.com/sustainoss. That would be really nice. Tell your boss, tell your manager, tell your friends. And of course, follow us on social media and share this podcast and talk about it. This protocol only exists in the sense that it gets in your brain, then you talk to other people about it, should we really sustain our software? So with that all having been said, if you're going to talk about it, you should totally use HTML because it's a really good protocol for talking about things. And if you're going to, you should use htmx, which is really cool. And then you should thank Alexander and say good luck to him in your head, just as I'm saying it to him now. Thank you so much for coming on. Good luck. And
I had a great conversation. Thank you for having me.